It's another episode of the Senator Omer Rains Show. Come join us here at the Reno Town Mall. Get in the audience or get behind a microphone. You can also text in questions at 775-237-2266 to speak with Senator Omer Rains or his guests. That number's 844-790-TALK. Again, it's 844-790-8255. Without further ado, let's get to the creator and host, Senator Omer Rains.
No, we're not going to do that. We're going to come directly to yours truly, Eddie Floyd, because I've decided to do something with Senator Omer Rains' permission. We're going to start weekly getting to know our show host better and better and better. You all know that Senator Omer Rains was, without a doubt, the most popular California state senator in the history of California. He had 1.5 million constituents up in Northern California. And I've got to share with you right now, he is one of the most humble men I have ever met in my life. So I'm going to get down and dirty. We're going to find out where this man came from, and I guarantee it wasn't the edge of heaven. So let's see what we can come up with today. Where were you and when were you born?
Well, I'm a doddering old man with drivel coming from my mouth. I was born in 1941, before we entered the war. I was born in a small, well, in a farm, but near a small farming community of Barnett, Missouri, in the northern Missouri Ozarks.
Wow. Okay. Did you have any siblings, Senator?
I did, and there's a long story about that. His name was Roy. He's passed on. He was, unless you met our parents, you would think, are you really related? He was much bigger than me. I'm a fairly tall man. I was 6 feet, but he was about 6'3". He was very broad, very, very big bone, much bigger bone than am I. He had red hair, freckles. His name was Roy. Why Roy? Because that was a family name. I had a great-grandfather Roy. I had a grandfather Roy. I had a father Roy. I had a brother Roy and a nephew Roy. And they ended up within the family all being known by other names. Like my father was Junior and my brother Roy, within the family only, was Sonny. And
anybody named Bubba, that's all I need to know.
No Bubba.
Bubba.
No, that was Bill Clinton.
That was Bill Clinton. Okay, now let me ask you this. Why were you born in that tiny farming community?
Well, good question. My brother Roy was actually born in San Francisco in 1937, before me. Now, why was I born there? Because my father, who had been a professional baseball player in the Midwest, enjoyed a lot of success. And in those days, almost every town had a baseball team. It was the national pastime.
Right.
And we had majors, AAA, AA, open classification, A, B, C, and D. My father enjoyed success. He gets signed by San Francisco Seals. There were these large burgeoning cities out on the West Coast: San Diego, San Francisco, Oakland, L.A., Seattle, Portland, and so on. And they were not part of the major leagues. Why? Because professional baseball did not extend beyond St. Louis in those days.
Wow.
And they traveled, with it by train and railroads. There was no commercial traffic. It wasn't until 1958 that the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn to L.A. and the Giants from New York to San Francisco.
Absolutely.
So my brother was born when my father was playing baseball with the San Francisco Seals, because he had caught the attention of scouts, and he encouraged, not only encouraged, but they offered a contract to my father to go out and play in San Francisco with the Seals. And what he did, he ends up playing with Joe DiMaggio, Vince DiMaggio, Dominic DiMaggio,
wow,
Lefty O'Doul, and a lot of players later to gain great fame. Now, in late 41, he gets signed by the St. Louis Cardinals, and it's right before we enter the war. But all of a sudden, he's headed for St. Louis. My maternal grandparents lived in a farming area, and he decided to take the family there, where I was born, on a farm near a farming village. And as he hoped to embark on a career with the great Gas House Gang, the Cardinals who had dominated baseball during those years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the war broke out, and so that's why we were living in this farming village.
Now, I have a question for you while you're on that farming village, if you don't mind. 2 small questions, quick yes or no answers. You mentioned just about every league I can possibly think of, other than, were there not black leagues where you came from as well? No? Okay, good. Now, describe...
I don't know if it was good, but it was true.
Well, yeah, but that's okay. I mean, see, when I say good, I just wanted to know so we didn't go into it in detail.
Right. No, many years later, Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby broke the color barrier.
The color barrier, and thank God they did, because then baseball took on a whole new meaning as far as yours truly is concerned. Now, you mentioned to me that little farming village, and that little village was called Barnett. Describe Barnett to me, Senator.
Barnett was a tiny, really tiny farming village in the northern Ozarks, about 60 miles south of Jefferson City, the state capital. There was always a sign at the end of town saying population 200, nowhere near population 200. Why did they do that? Because the state of Missouri would not pave roads unless they had 200 people. We still did not have paved roads, but they did come in and grade the dirt roads.
There you go. I love that.
We had one church, we had one store, we had no electricity or running water. None.
Wow. Now, of course, Barnett is in the Bible Belt, okay? And so I've got to ask you this. Without plumbing or electricity, how did you get along, Senator? From where did you get your water, and where in the world did you go to the bathroom?
Well, we had a water well right outside the back door of my grandparents' home, because that's where we were going to be living, apparently, during the war, which was about to erupt, or at least our entry into the war. And the water pump is what we used.
Right.
The outhouse, on the other hand, was far removed for obvious reasons.
Sure.
But my grandparents, my parents, everybody in my family, they were consumed with cleanliness. Now, that was a major undertaking, because in order to bathe, we had a big tub inside, but we would have to continually pump water and bring it in, pour it into the tub, and heat the water.
Heat it up, sure.
In order to bathe. And then that was necessary many times a day, especially with a young kid who was rolling in mud almost constantly. But the outhouses was interesting as well, because there was no toilet paper. The outhouse was a long way removed.
Sears calendar?
Well, close. We used Spiegels.
Okay.
And what we called monkey wards, which was Montgomery
Ward. Sure. Okay.
And in the corner, in case neither of those were available to tear the sheets out, we had corn cobs stacked in the corner. And now a lot of people say, well, that's crazy. Well, if you grew up in that era where more than half of America lived in that type of farming environment, that was common.
Yeah, absolutely common. I was potty trained on an outhouse, okay? And you mentioned the pump at the well.
Oh, yes.
Okay, now what's the last thing you ever do? You fill that little cup with water so that you can prime that pump again when you get started.
You always prime the pump. You have to indeed.
All right. Now, here's what I'd like you to do. Tell us about your maternal grandparents, sir.
My grandfather was named Omer Emanuel Cochran, and my grandmother was Tracy Sullivan. They were the most wonderful people I've ever known. I mean that literally. And most wonderful people I've ever been around had the greatest impact on me, probably, other than perhaps my mother, but especially my grandpa. He owned most all of the farming machinery in the area. And across the street from the house was a big shed. And in it, he had all of the farming equipment in the area. Now, that whole area today is, and because this changed face of America, is controlled by agribusiness. You know, the ConAgras, the Tysons, the Archer Daniels Midland, the Monsantos, etc.
Sure.
But in those days, they were small farms all over the country, usually 40 acres in size.
Well, I've got a surprise for you right now. I've told Adam, our acting engineer now, because Craig had to go to his aunt's funeral, but I told Adam to please, no commercials. This is so important that more people know about our radio talk show host like Senator Omer, and that's Omer. Rains, okay? So tell me, was Barnett in the Bible Belt?
Was it ever? We it was interesting. We had one church in town, the Barnett Union Church. But we had Lutherans, we had Methodists, we had Presbyterians, and
Baptist.
We had Baptists.
Amen.
Absolutely. On the outskirts of town, not really, they were kind of a quaint addition, but not part of the community itself. We had Amish, we had Brethren, we had Mennonites, and they gave a quaint aspect with their horse and buggies, on the roads and what have you. But it was definitely part of the Bible Belt, and they were all Protestants.
You know, I've got to ask you this question because Shari and I out at the Wynema Ranch, where you've had the pleasure and we've had the honor of having you come out and visit us there at the Wynema Ranch, we had the Mennonites build 2 cabins for us. I can look you in the eye, Senator, and tell you I have never met a more honest group of people in my entire life.
Well, it is amazing. And if you go to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, especially the head of the Amish community around Intercourse and the communities that were important there and are to this day important, then you will really find how hardworking, diligent these people are, how smart they are, and they're doing it without power, without electricity.
Wow. Unbelievable. What influence did church and the religion and the religious activities have in the area? Were your grandparents involved in church activities?
My grandmother was easily the most involved person at that church. It did not matter about the congregation. As a matter of fact, it's interesting, we had revolving ministers. Since we had only one church, one Sunday it would be Lutheran, the next Sunday would be a Presbyterian, next Sunday a Baptist, the next Sunday Methodist, and my grandmother was the organist, regardless. The pianist, she was the choir director. She was the author of all written material put out by the church. Interestingly enough, my grandfather was one of the few people in town who didn't attend church because he thought it strange that these various denominations all sounded alike to him, and quite frankly to me as well. But the preachers rode circuit, and my grandpa and I on Sunday, I would always be at church, but I would run home real quickly to be with my grandpa, and we'd be out in the front porch on a swing. He'd be looking down the road, looking for the minister, because the minister, regardless of denomination, would always come over for Sunday dinner, or what we called supper in those days.
Chicken and mashed potatoes.
Well, as a matter of fact, he would be looking for the car. And when he saw it come around the only corner in town, he would say, "Well, Omer, here comes one of those chicken eaters. We better get in. There won't be none left for us."
You better believe it.
And all my life, when I talked to a minister or a priest or a rabbi or whatever, I would bring up that story, and they all end up laughing.
Absolutely.
So you would be a chicken eater.
I would be a chicken eater in his eyes, that's for sure. What influence did church and the religious activities have in the area where your grandparents involved in the church activities?
Well, it influenced almost everything that went on in this little community. And again, we had farms all around. My grandfather, in fact, had 2 farms just on the outskirts of town. One was farmed by an uncle and aunt, Henry and Gwendolyn, and the other farm was by a caretaker, though my grandfather was out there every day.
Wow.
So, yeah, and I can't think of anything that happened that wasn't influenced by church activities.
Well, that brings me to my next question with tongue-in-cheek. Did you ever get in trouble while living in Barnett?
Oh, Lord, yes. By modern-day standards, it wouldn't be big trouble, but it surely was then. I had a lot more when I got to California. But we had the Rock Island Line that went right through.
Really?
The famous Rock Island line. And did you ever, for example, did you ever see the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Oh, absolutely.
George Clooney, my all-time favorite.
Gotta be.
All-time favorite comedy. Anyway, you remember the pump cars?
Oh, sure.
Well, Rock Island line, they had pump cars, and we would sneak down, get on those cars, and pump up and down the tracks. I knew I would get in big trouble, but it was worth it.
It was absolutely worth it.
And beneath the railroad track, it was kind of elevated, and we'd find grapevine, and we would go down and smoke it. Well, nobody in my family ever, either side of my family, the Cochrans, the Rainses, didn't matter what age, etc. No one drank, no one smoked.
Wow.
And I was really blessed from that standpoint.
Boy, you sure were. Like I like to tell people, I was born in Mayport, Florida, which is a fishing village with a drinking problem, okay?
Anyway, I'd get in trouble from because they would find out that I was smoking with another kid my age. Billy Gunn was his name. I was smoking grapevine, which...
Look, I want to get the test on those grapevines. Now, Senator, let me ask you this. How much diversity were you exposed to in Barnett?
Well, strangely, none. I mean, ethnically, everyone was of European, Caucasian.
Sure.
The religions, it was all Protestant. If there was any sexual orientation differed from what was probably the
norm.
Yeah, what we would call the norm. No one ever knew it. And by the way, there are no secrets in a small village.
My favorite story, and you'll love this, Senator. A fish lays 1,000,000 eggs on the bottom of the ocean, okay, and nobody knows it. But a chicken can lay one egg in a small village like Barnett, and everybody knows it.
You betcha.
Did you?
Well, that brings up, there are, first of all, we just described this area in which I grew up. Was it a true reflection of America? No. Not then, not now, not ever. But it was what I experienced growing up.
Right. Now, did you have any other relatives in that area of Barnett, sir?
Well, I did. I had my mother's sister, Gwendolyn, had married a man named Henry Bergstresser. And so Uncle Henry and Aunt Gwendolyn and their son Jerry lived on one of the two farms that I just described. I had a great-grandfather, James. In fact, in my international best-selling book, I have a photograph of my great-grandfather, James, who's at the time 95, 96. He's got a long white beard, a full head of white hair. Amazingly, having been a farmer out in the sun every day of his life, there is not a line in his face.
Unbelievable.
When I'm about 3 months old, he's got his bib overalls on out in his front porch, and I'm on his lap, and I think you've seen that photograph.
Yes, I have.
I'm really proud of that photograph.
We'll
probably come back and bring him up again.
Because what a wonderful, wonderful man to grow up with. What, with the war and all, was the family involved in any of the military branches at all?
Well, from the Revolutionary War forward, my family was always involved in wars, and they suffered greatly. For example, my grandfather, Omer Emanuel, had two brothers, Boone, named after Daniel Boone, and Abraham. They called him Ab, named after Abraham Lincoln. And in trench warfare in World War I, they had really gotten cut up and maimed badly. And my grandfather himself did not suffer that type of injury, but a grenade went off in his face when he was in the trench, and caused terrible loss of sight. In those days, we didn't have the technology that we have today, LASIK surgery, etc.
Right.
And as a result, although he could see, he had to wear glasses that were very thick, like bottom of Coke bottles.
Sure.
So, everyone had suffered during war. Actually, I'm the first one, and I'm not saying this because I'm proud of it or not proud of it, in my entire family history that I can discern, who didn't serve in the military. Why? Because I fell right between Korea and Vietnam.
That's right. And a lot of people did, Senator. There's no apology needed, okay? It's happened to a lot of people. Now, how was the harvesting done in that area? Were you ever allowed to participate in that?
Well, I was, primarily to boost my own ego, I suppose. The fact is that, and this is a fascinating story, and it was true throughout many parts of the country. Farming was done on a collectivism basis. By that I mean the following. My grandfather, in a shed across the street from our home, had all of the equipment, the hay balers, the thrashing machines, the tractors, and so on. And because harvesting was a major project for any farmer, usually just a farmer and his wife, maybe a child. And so everyone would gather together and harvest the crops of one farm.
Wow.
And all the women would cook on that farm. They would gather together. It would be a huge midday meal. And as soon as the harvesting was done for that farmer, we would move everything to the next farm.
Wow.
And everybody helped.
Unbelievable.
And that went from farm to farm to farm to farm to farm until everybody's crop had been harvested.
I love that.
So it was a form of collectivism. I don't know how else to put it.
No, there is no other way to put it. And I've got to tell you, I'll never forget my grandmother one time. I was eating lunch at her house, and I was doing my typical job of eating everything in sight. And she looked at me and said, "Bubba, you eat like a thrasher." And I thought she was talking about some shark, okay? I didn't know what she was talking about. Was your grandfather involved in the farming activities in the area? And if so, in what way? And I think you might have described a lot of that just now. Is that right?
Well, he was definitely involved at all times. And, of course, his equipment, again, was being used. And he had the John Deere and Casey tractors, and all of which were cranked in the front. Unlike any starting mechanism of today, but he worked with all the others and completely from farm to farm to farm until the harvesting for the entire region had been accomplished, had been finished.
Unbelievable. Now, what came of the harvested crops, Senator? Was there a railroad close by that you could ship them off?
The famous Rock Island line came right through that area, and it was actually quite close to the home in Barnett. And next to it was a huge grain silo, really important, especially during the war.
Oh, sure. Makes me want to break out in the theme song to Where Art Thou, Brother? Okay.
Yeah, great.
Wasn't that a great movie? Now,
it was.
Let me ask you a question because, if I'm not mistaken, your grandfather's name was Cochran, and of your interactions with him, okay? Tell us a little bit more about your grandfather.
My grandfather, everybody might say this, but he was the greatest man in my life, no doubt about it. He went every day out and did chores, and I went with him wherever he went. Again, my own father was away with wartime responsibilities.
Right.
So I didn't see my father, my real father, except one time when I was too young to even remember it, for the first 5.5 years of my life.
You know what? Now, quick question. Did your father ever have a baseball card? If so, I'd buy it from you right now.
If he did, I never saw it.
Okay. I guarantee it'd be worth millions of dollars right now.
He was not a Babe Ruth or a Ty Cobb.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. Just the age alone would make it worth that kind of money. Now, do me a favor. Also tell us a little bit more about your grandmother, Cochran.
Well, let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to skip over my grandfather that quickly because it was so important. Again, I was with him at all times, and he loved to go out to the farm. He loved to put me on the backs of pigs, cows, horses, and so on. And we had one sway-backed cow out there called Black Betsy, very old. And my brother Roy and my cousin Jerry and me would be on her back, sway-backed and all.
Unbelievable.
And, when I fell off the pigs or whatever, my grandfather would laugh heartily. He knew that would happen.
Oh, yeah.
My parents and grandparents, the women, would really be angry because they were such a stickler for cleanliness, and I would come home with mud all over me. And again, bathing was not an easy chore.
It was not an easy chore at all.
But Grandpa would also take me fishing down at the Lake of the Ozarks. The Osage River had been dammed, and that created the Lake of the Ozarks. And we would fish often near Bagnell Dam. Let me tell you something that I'll never forget.
Sure.
Because men were men in those days, I guarantee you.
Yeah, amen.
One day, and I don't know what my age was, probably 6 or 7. He goes out to the barn. He's got a terrible, terrible toothache, which he'd been complaining about. We didn't have any dentists or doctors or anything of that nature around. He said, I got to do something. This is killing me. He took out a pair of pliers, and he pulled his tooth, roots and all, out.
Oh, my God.
It just spurted blood like crazy.
Uh-huh.
My eyes, my brother was there as well. We were just in a state of shock. And, boy, would you take a pair of pliers to your tooth?
Not at all. Not for any reason on the face of this earth. Now, I think I know the answer to this one, but was anyone in the area prosperous?
Well, not by city standards. I guess by a little farming community, I guess my grandfather was probably the best off. He owned the equipment and what have you.
Right.
And I was later in life to learn that, and he never talked about this, that he had drilled most all of the water wells around the Lake of the Ozarks, which has the largest border of any lake in America. It's over 2,000 miles because
right.
When the Osage River was dammed, it went up all these channels and what have you, like rivers, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them. And when I went back as an adult several times, and I would go someplace or the other just traveling, and I would see photographs of my grandfather all over the place, drilling wells before I was born.
Wow, unbelievable. How did you wind up getting supplies such as gasoline and other items? Where were the stores close by, and were they close by?
We had one store, only one store. It was called Roughton's, and I guess in some fashion, probably not that close, but in some fashion they were related, I was told. But everything during the war years was rationed. I'm talking about everything. The toilet papers, cigarettes, kerosene, and so on and so forth. And I didn't think much about it at the time, and no one in my family smoked, with the exception of my Uncle Henry. And Roughton's hardly ever had cigarettes for him and drove him crazy because again, they were rationed and sent to the war, overseas.
Absolutely.
Cigarette smoking was huge in those days.
Absolutely.
But nobody in my immediate family smoked.
Well,
Zero.
They were very fortunate. Now, did you ever have a telephone in Barnett, and how did that come about if you did?
Well, shortly before we left Missouri for California, and by this time I'm 11 years of age, due to programs started by Franklin Roosevelt and continued by Harry Truman, I'm talking about the Rural Electrification Program, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and so on, a phone was brought in. It was hung on the wall. It had to be cranked. When it rang, it was like the Morse code. Everyone in the little farming community was on the same circuit. So you would listen very carefully to see if it was 2 longs, 2 shorts, 2 more longs,
really?
3 shorts. And it didn't matter, really, because it was a party line. Everybody was on the same line. So everyone listened in.
Oh, yeah.
There are no secrets
in a small town. You better believe it. Now, I understand there's a funny story about how you got your name. Is that true? And if so, tell us about it.
Well, it is a funny story, I think. Again, everyone in the family had a biblical name, and that included my father, Omer Emanuel, and everyone knows the word Emmanuel. They may not know Omer, but Omer is a common name in most parts of the world. It's found in the Bible. It basically is a festival of good harvest, and became very common in many parts of the world, especially in Western Europe, in Holland, in Belgium, in Norway, in other parts of Scandinavia, Belgium, France, and for example, in every French-speaking nation, everyone, there are towns or villages or cities called Omer.
Wow.
The largest in the northeast of France, about 35 miles south of Dunkirk and Calais, you find Omer. And there are 2 in Quebec province where French is the primary language.
Sure.
The Ivory Coast, it doesn't matter. Any French-speaking nation, you'll find Omers.
You know, Senator, I don't want to bring up a sore subject, but how long have your ancestors lived in that area? How long did they live in that area? And are they buried there, sir?
Well, the answer is yes. Yes. They had lived there many, many generations. My grandfather had come through the Cumberland Gap with Daniel Boone, and they settled in an area near the Osage River. And later, the name of Barnett came into being. And Booneville, named after Daniel Boone, obviously, was close by. But when the Osage River was dammed, what was called by the people in the community Old Barnett was underwater. Mm-hmm. So the town had to be resettled. Bodies that had been buried had to be exhumed before the flooding, and they were reburied in a cemetery called Hopewell, where about 225 years of my ancestors today are buried.
Wow.
And Hopewell is out kind of in the middle of nowhere, but if you know how to get there, it's really a beautiful cemetery. It had kind of gone into a decay area until some of us discovered that was happening, and since then, now it's beautiful again, and and a very large one.
Absolutely. Some of the most beautiful cemeteries in the world, like Savannah, Georgia. Same identical thing. Decrepit, but yet just have so much beauty to them. Now, I got to ask you a question. How in the heck, and I'm using the right word, starts with an H, how in the heck did you become so well-read and knowledgeable growing up in that farming environment?
You know, people often wonder about that. It was actually an enormous advantage. I went to a one-room schoolhouse. The teacher was Binford White, and there were only 8 or 9 in the entire schoolhouse. So if a young lad, in my case, maybe 7 or 8, listened attentively, Mrs. White, the teacher, would be talking about something far advanced, for example, my brother in the same schoolhouse. And if you were attentive, you could pick up things that perhaps would not ordinarily be taught to somebody my age.
Right.
So when I eventually, I'm going to skip ahead, when I eventually came to California with my family, I was so far ahead of what was being taught that they immediately had me skip a grade.
I think you were blessed with a great memory. Would you agree?
Many people have said that. That's something you either inherit, I think, or you don't. But there were a few other things that were important to my education back then. First of all, there was a mobile library that came through town once a month, and I checked out every single book they would allow me to check out. And they would always say, my gosh, how do you read all these books? Well, reading was really important. And bear in mind that to read, especially at night, it had to be by kerosene lamp or by candlelight, and I did.
Wow.
And that may have something to do with the passion I have for bringing literacy to the underdeveloped world and those who are disadvantaged, who don't have books, who don't know how to read, and what have you. Because even though I was the first in my family to ever graduate from college, everyone was articulate. Grammar was really, really emphasized. And I grew up in an educational mecca, if you will. And when my grandparents' Rains in Versailles, about 25 miles away, they actually, in their loft or attic, had every single edition of National Geographic ever done, starting in the 1880s.
No kidding.
And I would get up there and I would just voraciously read and dream of maybe someday visiting some of these places where there were exotic-looking people and garments and foods and things that I thought, my Lord, I've got to go there. And I did, beyond my wildest dreams.
You know, I don't want to take a lot of time with this answer, but it's so important to me. A lot of people don't know this, but all the proceeds from Back to the Summit, your best-selling book that's in just about every language on earth, okay, all goes to build libraries in underdeveloped countries. How many have you built so far, sir?
Difficult question to answer. I mean, I can tell you that there were 67 in Nepal. And when I retired from international chair of Reed Global, Rural Education and Development,
right,
we had built about 7 in Bhutan, and we had built about 15 thus far in India. Now that's 712, by the way.
Wow. Unbelievable.
And then I had worked in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, in South Africa, in Burkina Faso. Not all libraries, some on other types of humanitarian projects and activities, but that is a passion of mine.
You know, Senator, I tell you what I want to do. I want you to answer these next questions relatively quick, because the third question I'm going to ask you, I want you to spend a little more time on. What about manners, cleanliness, and things like that? And did attending a one-room schoolhouse set you back at all in your studies?
Well, no, as I indicated, I was way ahead in my studies by the time I came to California at age 11, way ahead.
Right.
And so the one-room schoolhouse was a huge advantage, not an impediment as many people assume.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sorry.
Well, you were asking me about manners or something of that sort. My family was sticklers. They really were sticklers for cleanliness and manners. I mean, everything was please, thank you, sir, ma'am, excuse me, and so on and so forth. Sometimes I'm so much in the habit of doing that, sometimes I even speak to my dogs that way.
You know what?
Excuse me, Spartacus. Oh, I'm sorry, Lakota.
Yeah.
Things of that sort.
Yeah, I got to tell you.
And people laugh, and I'm not even thinking.
No.
I'm not even thinking about it. It just comes naturally.
You know what? I tell you, it comes naturally to, in my opinion, to everybody born and raised in the South and in Missouri and in Arkansas. But that's just a personal opinion. What about your paternal grandparents? Where did they live and what were they like, sir?
Well, they lived about 25 miles away in a place called Versailles, spelled like Versailles in French, but Versailles is a common name in much of America. And my grandfather owned most of the buildings around the county courthouse. It was the county courthouse of Morgan County, Missouri, even though there were only about 6,000 people in there. The town had a grocery store owned by my father. He had a playhouse and recreation center called Roy's Playhouse and Recreation Hall. He had religious signs everywhere, and pictures of Jesus everywhere. Mm-hmm. But the main thing, if you used any profanity at all in Roy's Playhouse or in any of his buildings, you were never allowed to enter again.
Unbelievable.
And the effect on rough-hewn farmers and testosterone-charged teenagers was remarkable.
Unbelievable.
I mean, you talk about minding your P's and Q's. They knew the rule. They knew it would be enforced, and they were always on their best behavior.
You better.
I'm sorry, I got to bring up one other thing about that, because what happened, this is long after I left, Walmart put in a store outside the community, just on the outskirts.
Sure.
Land is cheap. And you go to that was a vibrant, those small community, it was vibrant as a county seat.
Sure.
And today, almost all of those shops and stores are boarded up, because when Walmart came in, people found, oh my God, we can buy this and that and almost everything we need far cheaper. And that's what's happened all over the world.
Yes.
Walmart it's a two-edged sword. It obviously has been good in many ways, but it's really destroyed the small communities. And that's why a lot of communities now are objecting to Walmart when they even want to come in.
Right. And I understand that completely, okay? Now, let me ask you this. Was Versailles or Versailles as religious as Barnett, and was it similar in other ways as well?
In a way, the answer is yes. In a way, no. It was as religious in that people talked much the same and they were almost all Protestant again. However, they weren't involved. I mean, it was a different type of situation.
Right.
It was more just, it's the way we are.
Right.
But there wasn't much involvement. And my grandparents, Rains, were deeply religious, very deeply religious. But they were not as involved in their church. And we were all Methodists, by the way, throughout the family, both sides.
Sure.
But they were not nearly as involved as the Cochrans and Sullivans down in Barnett.
Right. Was Versailles as religious as Barnett? And was it similar in other ways as well, sir?
No, not really, because it had running water, terrible water. My grandfather's place had the freshest, most pure water because he had drilled it right outside the back door of the home in Barnett. But they had municipal water in Versailles, but it was heavy with sulfur. Did not taste nearly as well.
And stunk.
It did.
Yeah.
It did. And, but they had things that had been brought together by mainly FDR. So it was a different environment. It really was.
This is my question because I'm very interested. After the war, did your father return to a career in baseball, sir?
Well, I'm sorry to say that was his lifelong dream, and because of wartime responsibilities, he had suffered an injury to his shoulder and arm, and he was unable to play, and that was true of almost all baseball players and other athletes who had gone to the war.
Amen.
One or two exceptions, the most prominent being obviously Ted Williams.
Right.
That's an amazing story. He came back after 5 years of war effort and didn't miss a beat, and batted .406 the year he returned. Well, that's a remarkable story.
Unbelievable. What did your father do career-wise without baseball in his life?
Well, he dreamed of going back to California because before I was born in 1937 and before, I think, did I mention about Joe DiMaggio and others?
Yes. You mentioned that he played with them and all the brothers and things like that. And I tell you what, I'm totally amazed. You know, I've been with you now for years, and I'm amazed. I'm so glad we're doing this to get to learn about our show host. So this is going to continue on America Matters Media, where one host will interview another host and learn more about them and how they were actually raised and how they became so famous like you did, sir.
Well, my father, because his baseball career really was over, he bought a recreation center in Independence, Missouri, not far from, kind of a suburb of Kansas City. More importantly, it was the hometown of the president, Harry Truman.
First president you met, wasn't it?
It was. I'm 5 years old, I think, 6 maybe. And Truman, when he came from D.C., from the capital, to his home, which he enjoyed doing in Independence, he would be walking around all the time, and with one or two people with him, and not at all like the Secret Service and everything we have today around our president. And Truman walked into the recreation hall one day, and I had no idea. He was just a fellow with glasses and what have you. And anyway, he came up to me and he said hi to me. He shook my hand, and my father, who was a rock rib Republican, said, you're going to remember this. You may not remember the significance of this man at this point in time, but you will in the future.
Wow.
And I'm sorry to say that November 22, 1963, the assassination of JFK changed everything in our country completely.
Absolutely. Now, when you were living in Independence for a short period, did you remain in touch with your grandparents in Barnett? And if so, how long did you do so?
Oh, absolutely. I would frequently, in fact, this was an important incident in my life. I think it had a great effect. My grandmother would be awaiting me in Barnett with my grandfather. My mother would dress me up with short pants, tie, would have a lunch bag and what have you, and I would board alone the Rock Island line. The conductors were so wonderful. Oh my God, they were African American, all of them, and they would always assure my mother, "Don't worry, we're going to take care of Omer. You believe us, and you have nothing to worry about." And that was always true.
Wow.
So I've never been worried about traveling alone, and often in dangerous parts of the world. Not that this was the dangerous part, but I've often thought of that experience. And I wonder if that got me into a mindset where I was comfortable traveling alone, wherever I was in the world, and often I have.
I would agree with you with that comment because I know you. I know you like the back of my hand, and you are easygoing, and you are comfortable no matter where you go or what part of town you happen to be in. Why did your parents, along with you, your brother, leave the area and head to California?
Well, my father had always talked about returning to California, where the streets were paved with gold. I mean, again, they are in San Francisco long before I'm born, back playing baseball back, for example, in 37, 4 years before I'm born. They're there when the Golden Gate Bridge is opened, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge is opened, Treasure Island is built to house the Pan-Pacific Exposition and the 1939 World's Fair. Can you imagine, Eddie, can you even imagine how that struck two young kids from rural America?
No, I can't.
I mean, their eyes were no doubt big.
Unbelievable. Now, I've got to ask you a question.
I've got to add, unfortunately, when we got to California, because of a job that had been promised, we didn't end up in San Francisco. We ended up in a god-awful place, Bakersfield. But that's a whole nother story.
That's a whole nother story. Believe me, I had Bakersfield Cascade and Fresno Cascade, so I know what you are talking about. Have you ever regretted growing up in a rather isolated and rural area? And I'm going to follow up with another question that I'd like you to belabor. Did it ever cross your mind that, hey, I'm running for one of the largest offices as senator here in the great state of California, and here I am from Barnett, okay? I mean, did that ever cross your mind at all?
It really didn't. I realized that I had been privileged. Not many people will agree with this, but I felt I was privileged that I had spent most of my formative years outside, playing stickball and other activities, most always in the dirt, unfazed by all of the distractions of modern-day life. So I was privileged. I did not feel that was an impediment. Anyone who felt that way, God bless them, they were wrong.
You know, and I'm going to jump in real quick right now and tell you something that just like me, okay, you know, I'm going to guess that you played with frogs when you were little, but I don't see a single solitary wart on your hands or your arms anywhere.
I, to this day, love frogs. And yes, we had frogs all around, and I played with them a lot, and I liked them. And they're just fun. And they're also good to eat, by the way.
Amen. Amen. Hey, I've got another question for you that I think's going to take some thought, and really I want a true and honest answer. Let's take Barnett. Let's take Versailles or Versailles or however. Versailles. Okay, let's take Versailles or Barnett and stuff like that. Would you not agree with me that part of the problem in our nation today, Senator Omer Rains, is the fact that even these little rural, beautiful little communities wound up getting manners and getting God out of those towns? Am I wrong?
No, you are right. No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
You know,
and by the way, in those days, little communities like this were so important to the war effort. You know, we had this grain, I mentioned the grain silo.
Yes, sir.
And it was important. I mean, the Rock Island would stop there. The grain silo was very large, and it was important for the war effort.
Oh, absolutely.
And both Roosevelt and Truman were so determined to tie this country together because, again, over half the people lived on farms. And take public utilities.
Right.
They were all private at that time.
Right.
So they were in New York, they were in Chicago, they were in Los Angeles and San Francisco, large communities where it could be
affordable.
Utilities could afford to run it out and make a profit. They couldn't do that running lines out to a farm.
No.
Impossible. And that changed, again, with rural electrification and other programs that did bring electricity and things of that nature to the entire country. not just the two coasts and the big cities.
You know, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people don't know this, and I certainly am going to bring it up before this show is over, and that's the fact that in a prior life you were an attorney. And two of my favorite...
Do I have to admit that?
No, you don't have to admit it, because I see some people with rocks in their hands outside the studio. But let me ask you a question. Am I wrong, but if my memory serves me correct, two of your favorite clients happen to be Charlton Heston and Steve McQueen. Am I wrong?
No, that's correct.
I mean, they live near you?
Along with Evel Knievel and Johnny Cash.
Evel Knievel. Johnny Cash, who never spent a day in prison.
No, he did not.
He never did spend. He spent one night in jail, but never in prison. But I got to share with you, Senator, what was that moment in your life that said, this young man, okay, this young man from this small farming community of Barnett is going to run for senator of the great state of California?
Well, it never occurred to me growing up, but, in my book, as you mentioned, it's an international bestseller. I did talk extensively about the way in which that occurred and how I was brought into that when the political cauldron in the coastal area of California, most of the area between L.A. and San Francisco, was left open because of the death of one man. And
wow,
things happened thereafter that, in my case, I guess were very therapeutic or are good for me for a lot of reasons.
Right. You know, I got to ask you this, Senator, okay? If you had to live your whole life over again, and I'm talking about Versailles, I'm talking about Barnett, I'm talking about no running water, no electricity, no paved roads, okay? And then going on to become the world's most known, if you will, and renowned senator, the youngest Senate majority leader ever in the state of California, would you do it all over again the same way?
Well, I made a lot of mistakes along the way. We all have, my Lord, we're all complicated creatures. But basically the answer is yes.
Good.
It really is.
Well, you're one of my heroes. Let me just tell you that.
There are things I would do differently, but not many.
Yeah.
I do want to add one other thing about my family because it's part of the humor. Well, we're going to run out of time. I can see that. But on another occasion, I'll bring it up. And again, it has to do with my name.
I love it. I love it. Senator, I want to thank you for your honesty, your humility, and your, if you will, time sharing with me on the Senator Omer Rains Show.